I want to thank you all so much for joining us for our first completely virtual program here at the Byrd Center. You guys are participating in history as it unfolds, so we appreciate it very much. I want to start off just by saying that the story that I'm sharing today from the archive is one that we initially started digging into several years ago, and we actually did a digital exhibit about it on the Byrd Center's website called The Path to the Chairman's Seat. The story it's an interesting one if you like getting into all of the sort of political intrigue of the House and the Senate, and it has its dramatic moments, and I'll cover some of those today. But revisiting this story in light of our present events going on in our own community and around the country has certainly added a new layer of context to this story in terms of the bigger picture within the time that it occurred and how it continues to affect us today. So that's why we sort of broadened it a bit and talk about the 1964 presidential election as a whole, and how that has in many ways continued to shape the way that our national political elections unfold. So it is a story that, I guess, to say all that is to say, we've kind of looked at it, we've re-looked at it, and now in a whole new light that's kind of brought some new importance and meaning to this story. So as we get started, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you all will see a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll bring up full screen here. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. So there will be a couple points, 3 points in particular through the program where I do want to pause and I'll pose a question. And so I invite you at that point to turn your microphone on and provide anything you would like, commentary or answers to those questions that we pose. But let's get started. The 1964 election, in which incumbent Lyndon Johnson trounced Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, had a lasting impact on the trajectory of American history, and it set the stage for one of the most productive periods in congressional history. This election was especially consequential for one West Virginia Congress member whose papers now reside here at the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education. Political commentators and pundits throughout 1964 thought this campaign to be one of the most difficult, arduous, and dirty affairs that they had ever seen. Of course, one would wonder what they would think about our own campaigns today. Enormous questions loomed over every debate, campaign stop, and interview. Questions of civil rights for Black Americans. Questions about social safety net programs, the use of nuclear weapons, and America's future. While Goldwater was soundly defeated in his bid for the White House, he did succeed in one major area, and that was the South, wresting South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana from almost a century of Democratic dominance and bringing them into the Republican fold, where they've largely remained. In this regard, the 1964 election has continued to shape and impact our two national political parties and every major election since over the 60 years since Johnson's victory. So we titled this program Democrats for Goldwater. And that title comes from an artifact which you see on the screen and which you can also see behind me here on the table. It is a yard sign from the campaign in 1964. It was donated to the Byrd Center along with a large collection of campaign ephemera from Scott Faulkner and Harper's Ferry a few years ago. And obviously there's a immediate irony when you look at this political artifact. But in the RSVP link to the event today, several people asked the question of why would a Democrat vote for Barry Goldwater? Obviously, he was the Republican nominee in 1964, and Lyndon Johnson was the Democratic nominee. So that question does permeate this entire story. What caused so many people to turn on their party and to vote in the opposite direction? When Goldwater swung the South for the Republican Party, he had seized a moment when both of the largest political parties in the United States were very divided. President Johnson and members of the 88th Congress had faced significant backlash across many parts of the United States, especially in the South, for their vote in support of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a senator representing Arizona, Goldwater had his own interesting record when it came to voting on civil rights for Black Americans. When he did vote for the civil rights bills of 1957 and 1960, but his support only came after both bills had been significantly weakened and watered down through amendments. Senator Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and as a result lost the support of several of his Republican colleagues. His opposition, at least in his own view at the time, was not rooted in racism, but as a question of whether federal government had overstepped, whether this sweeping law infringed upon the 10th Amendment and was a knock against the political authority of the states. In his own state, he had pushed to end discrimination in public education and in the Arizona National Guard. But nevertheless, his vote against the Civil Rights Act engendered support from Southern Democrats who vehemently opposed this bill. In 1964, this election was revolving around many massive questions in addition to civil rights. In May of 1964, President Johnson addressed students at Ohio University and for the first time in a speech used the phrase Great Society. And a few weeks later, he further expounded on this vision by highlighting areas that he would focus on: urban renewal, environmentalism, and education as a part of this great society. Goldwater had opposed expansion of social safety net programs at this time. He had proposed making Social Security voluntary. He had several times suggested the government sell the Tennessee Valley Authority. And in referring to efforts by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, Goldwater summed them up as, quote, a dime store New Deal. Eisenhower didn't take very kindly to that and would not endorse him in the campaign. Goldwater's rhetoric and frequently extreme language shaped the course of the campaign. His foreign policy views led the Johnson campaign to put out one of the most famous political commercials in American history, known as the Daisy Girl, which was meant to illuminate Goldwater's brinksmanship stance when it came to foreign affairs after he had advocated the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Across the United States and in West Virginia, the major questions at stake in the 1964 campaign divided communities and united others. In the state's delegation, West Virginia's members in Congress, this question had divided people. The state's entire House delegation at the time, 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, all voted in support of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 2 senators, Senator Randolph and Senator Byrd, were divided. Senator Byrd voting against, Senator Randolph voting for the Civil Rights Act. The issue clearly divided people and it transcended party lines. Randolph and Byrd were both Democrats, And Arch Moore, the lone Republican in the state's delegation at the time, had played a key role in protecting the bill as it went through the House Judiciary Committee and blocking attempts by Southern Democrats to weaken the provisions of the Civil Rights Act. Next two slides are going to show some documents from the archives here at the center, and I want to show you where they come from. So on the screen, they just look like a newspaper clipping, but they actually come from scrapbooks. We have these for both Congressman Harley Staggers Sr. and Senator Robert C. Byrd's collections. We have about 200 of them for Senator Byrd. For Congressman Staggers, we have about a dozen, and his are much larger than Senator Byrd's in terms of the pages. I can barely get them all on the Zoom window, but this is what they look like. The pages with the newspaper clippings posted to them. They're arranged in chronological order, and it's simply every time the congressman's name was mentioned in a newspaper, was clipped and sent to the office, and the staff pasted it in these books. They used them for a quick reference material. If they wanted to know where the congressman was on a certain day, or what had been said about a certain appearance or a vote or a speech, this was an easy way. They had them right in the office to quickly go and reference what the senator or the congressman had done or said on a certain matter. And we use these all the time. These are some of the most useful documents in the Byrd's archives because they kind of act as an index to the entire collection. So the next two slides are going to show two clippings found in Congressman Staggers' scrapbooks. Days before the election, two newspapers in two towns located barely 10 miles apart from each other in the Potomac Highlands of West Virginia printed editorials which clearly reveal the opposing sides in the 1964 campaign. The Grant County Press of Petersburg wrote, quote, "We support the Goldwater-Miller ticket because the present accelerated slide toward the socialist state with all of its hated controls and loss of freedom seems to be the thing that Johnson and Humphrey have been talking about, but simply under another name." Nearby to the east, the Moorfield Examiner published an editorial in which they stated, "The Republican candidate, at least he's supposed to be running as a Republican, Baron Morris Goldwater, and his hatchet man, William Miller, have based their entire campaign on smear, calumniation, vilification, innuendo, sneers, and hints, mostly impersonal attacks on the president. Not once have they faced the issues. They have as yet to offer constructive proposals." And perhaps most succinctly, Dr. J. Buell Shannon of Elkins wrote in the Randolph Enterprise Review simply, "There was no gold in Goldwater except fool's gold." When the campaign was over, Lyndon Johnson was reelected with a resounding victory. Goldwater only carried his home state of Arizona and the 5 southern states he had swung to the Republicans. So this is the first of 2 points where I want to get your comments and feedback. The documents that were shared in the email with the Zoom link this morning included this one that you see on the screen. Probable legislative proposals dated January 6, 1965. It's a 3-page memo from the Congressional Quarterly. It's outlining ideas that people thought were going to come before the Congress in that year. This is immediately after the Johnson victory over Goldwater. So my question to you is, if you had a chance to read through this or to look at it quickly, because it is a bulleted list, does this look like the Great Society to you that we think of today, almost 60 years after its passage? Does this look like what you think of when you think of the Great Society? Curious to get anybody's feedback on that. Please feel free to share. It is an interesting document because it gives you an idea of how the members of Congress were preparing to come into this moment. it seems as though there was a sense of, this is it, right? We have the mandate. We've been returned in significant numbers and gained numbers. And the moment is kind of rife for this time of dramatic change. And you see it outlined in this memo. One of the things I'll highlight is, and if you join us 2 weeks from now on the 27th of June, our program is going to feature significantly the third item on that list, which is referred to on here as the Appalachian Bill. So I'll just leave that as a little Easter egg. That's going to be the focus of our program 2 weeks from now. But as you look down through it, you probably will find that there are lots of ideas in here that we do think of when we look back at the Great Society. Things like Medicare and increasing Social Security, immigration. You'll go down and through and you'll read environmental proposals, housing proposals. But as we'll see, additional ideas that we're not so quick to think about with the Great Society. I want to highlight at this point a large collaborative project that the Byrd Center contributed to, and that this document and a lot of the ones that you see in the presentation today and others from the Byrd Center's collections were featured in. And it's a digital exhibit called The Great Society Congress. It was put together by the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress, which the Byrd Center belongs to as a member institution. And Dr. Wyatt, our director here at the center, was one of the leading curators of that exhibit and its committee, made up of congressional repositories across the United States and also the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I think even the Library of Congress may have submitted a few things to it. But if you go into that exhibit, you can see where this memo ultimately led to in terms of the massive amounts of legislation that were passed into law in this 2-year period that we call the 89th Congress, 1965 and 1966. So the 89th Congress convened for the first time in January 1965, and both the House and the Senate were controlled by the Democratic Party. And despite having a supermajority, the Democratic Party was not very divided, mainly over issues like civil rights, but all these issues that had torn apart the parties in the 1964 campaign came to a head. The immense progress that was made in this Congress is a testament to bipartisanship, because provisions like all of the Great Society programs, the War on Poverty programs, civil rights legislation, it took bipartisan compromise between the more progressive-leaning wing of the Democratic Party at the time and likewise the more liberal-leaning Republican Party of the time. President Lyndon Johnson nominated Arkansas Congressman Orrin Harris to a federal judgeship early in 1965. Congressman Harris had previously been offered a nomination by President Kennedy, but he declined it, continuing instead in his powerful position as the chairman of the House Commerce and Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, or as it's known today, the Commerce and Energy Committee. Whatever President Johnson did to convince Harris to accept this nomination, it's likely that he did it because he knew Harris's political philosophy and his past record represented a challenge to what he hoped to accomplish in the Great Society. Nevertheless, Congressman Harris did hold on through the first half of the 89th Congress, not leaving the House until early 1966 to assume his judgeship. And at that point, his successor took control. But a lot of things happened in the meantime, and that really sets the stage for our West Virginia congressman, whose career was changed forever in this moment. So on the screen, you see the picture of Congressman Harris, and then you see two other members of Congress next to him. Prior to the 1964 election, Harris's successor on the committee would have been Congressman John Bell Williams of Mississippi. First elected to Congress in 1946, Williams was a staunch segregationist and a vocal opponent to civil rights for Black Americans. His disdain for his Democratic colleagues who had voted for the landmark 1964 bill led Williams to endorse and campaign for Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964. And as a result, when he came back to Washington in January 1965, the Democratic caucus in the House stripped him of his seniority for his disloyalty, which meant that he fell from being the second-ranking Democrat on the committee and no longer a contender for the chairman's seat. But Williams was not the only person who was in line for this powerful committee position. Behind him was Congressman Kenneth Roberts of Alabama, who had also endorsed Goldwater. Unfortunately for him, he did such a good job supporting the Republican campaign in Alabama that he lost his seat to his Republican opponent, the incoming Congressman Arthur Glenn Andrews. With Williams and Roberts both out of the way, when Harris departed Congress, the path was open for West Virginia Congressman Harley O. Staggers Sr. to become the next chairman of one of the most powerful committees in the U.S. House of Representatives, having jumped 3 points in the rank within a year to assume this leadership position. Harley O. Staggers was largely unknown outside of West Virginia. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1948, representing the 2nd District, which at that time comprised the Eastern Panhandle, Potomac Highlands, and many of the counties on the eastern part of West Virginia bordering Virginia, going southeast. His district, unlike many of his colleagues in the state, did not have a lot of high coal mining areas. Instead, a lot of his district was agricultural, with some scattered centers of industry spread through there. One article in Roll Call summarized Congressman Staggers' career as almost being made to lead this committee, noting that he had worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, served as West Virginia's State Road Commission right-of-way agent, and served in the Navy during World War II as a pilot. Thus, he had experience with all 4 main modes of transportation that the committee would oversee and interstate commerce. So he was kind of naturally there. But he had also been a supporter for Lyndon Johnson. And that, of course, had a major factor as well coming into the 89th Congress. Staggers' political philosophy is questioned a lot in the articles that come out. In these scrapbooks, there are pages of newspaper articles with headlines like, "Who is Harley Staggers? Who is this man who is now leading one of the most powerful committees in Congress?" And in interviews, he's frequently asked to kind of define what his political philosophy was. And it's interesting, he uses a metaphor. Even though he had very high marks from liberal polling and liberal organizations in the country for his voting record, Congressman Staggers would not call himself a liberal, because it probably would have been political kryptonite to do that, representing a conservative district in a conservative state like West Virginia. But what he sort of shaped his political philosophy around was the idea of a pendulum. And he said in several newspaper articles that throughout United States history, this pendulum swung left, right, left, right. And at different moments, it was swung to that extent on the wave of popular desire for change and evolving the government and evolving the political system. And at other times, it swung in a manner that contracted that change or turned it back. And as for him, the moment in 1965, that pendulum had swung very much to the left. And he used that pendulum metaphor to engage in political change in a way that didn't seem as radical as some of his more outspoken colleagues made it sound. It was a smart tactic for him to use among his constituency in West Virginia, but it also enabled him to be a key player rising the leadership ladder in a Democratic Party that was rapidly changing its platform. In the summer of 1964, having been seriously ill with pneumonia, Congressman Staggers ignored the order from his doctor to spend a week at rest and recuperation at his home in Kaiser, and instead was back in Congress only 2 days later, arriving on July 1st, 1964, so that the next day he could cast his vote in favor of the Civil Rights Act. Congressman Staggers was poised to redirect the focus of his committee. Roll Call, the article that you see on the screen here, summarized this transition in the title, quote, "Big Business Casts Anxious Eye on Chairman Staggers." And this was certainly reflected in dozens of letters that Congressman Staggers received in the days after he assumed the chairmanship in early 1966, which are preserved in the archives here. Letters from the heads of Pan Am and the stock exchange on Wall Street, Bank of America, major business and corporate CEOs across the United States, trying to get in the door to let their presence be known among this largely unknown congressman from West Virginia, who is now in control of a committee that had a lot to do with their segment of the American economy. In his own words, in a policy statement issued on January 13th, 1966, Congressman Staggers declared that the Commerce Committee would become, quote, "consumer conscious." This was that marked change that Johnson had hoped for. It was conducive to pushing the Great Society agenda forward, and it would define how Harley Staggers would lead the Commerce Committee. The second document that was shared in the email this morning is the one you see on the screen here. This is kind of jumping ahead because this statement is made in October of 1966, after this incredibly productive period of Congress. And Congressman Staggers outlines all of the legislation that had come out of the Commerce Committee as a part of this push. But most importantly, in the beginning, opening line, he states, quote, "The term interstate and foreign commerce might imply that the legislation recommended and the activities conducted by our committee are concerned primarily, if not exclusively, with a variety of commercial enterprises rather than the average American citizen. Nothing can be farther from the truth." And he goes on to illustrate that in the bills that they had passed. In interviews with the press, Congressman Staggers framed his committee's priority shifting from corporations to consumers by stating that as one of the oldest committees in the House of Representatives, he and his colleagues were simply carrying out their constitutional duty to promote the general welfare. Indeed, the committee was busy under the leadership of Congressman Staggers in 1966. The image that you see here is of an event in the chamber where the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee held its hearings, and you can see Congressman Staggers standing at the podium in the center. Two of the major bills that Congressman Staggers outlines in that speech that I shared with you are ones that continue to impact you and me every day here in the United States. They are the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966 and the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. Both of these bills continue to impact us, and they're not ones that we often think about as being part of the Great Society, but as we'll see, they really are a core part of the overall mission and the interconnectedness of all of the areas of United States policy that were trying to be changed by Lyndon Johnson and his allies in the House and the Senate. In stating his case for the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, Congressman Staggers highlighted the extremely low standards of safety that were required at that point through various differing state laws and very little regulatory compliance from automobile manufacturers or retailers. In the article, he uses this rather humorous comparison and states, quote, "An automobile is a very complicated tool. Tools known to be, or I'm sorry, I skipped a line. An automobile is a very complicated tool. No law has ever been devised to make a screwdriver absolutely safe under all conditions. Tools known to be more dangerous are commonly regulated in some way by law. The automobile, however, has enjoyed practical immunity from legal regulation." The debate in the Commerce Committee over this bill included several notable figures, including Michigan Governor George Romney, and who spoke on behalf of the automobile industry. And on the side supporting the bill, one of the most ardent voices, Ralph Nader, fresh off the publication of his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Nader's testimony before Staggers' committee in the House and the Senate brought with it the support of thousands of people across the United States, a popular rebuke of the automobile industry's blatant ignorance for the safety of the consumers of their product. While Congressman Staggers did not exercise heavy influence over the bill while it was in the committee, trying to strike a balance between the opposing sides, he personally directed its debate on the House floor and won its passage. The bill was signed into law in a ceremony in the Rose Garden at the White House by President Johnson, and the same day he also signed the Highway Safety Act. Both of these laws forever changed the automobile industry and retail sectors, and it brought sweeping improvements to the nation's highways. The Packaging and Labeling Act endured a more difficult slog through the committee process. With so many industries embroiled in this proposed legislation, Chairman Staggers had to navigate many divided interests. His chief rival, Congressman Williams of Mississippi, attempted on several occasions to block the bill or to sneak provisions in that would weaken it, holding votes when members who supported the bill were not there. But eventually, Staggers outmaneuvered him on the committee and ushered the bill through a contentious markup to the floor of the House and to passage. It brought about, for the first time, regulations stating that products that contained harmful substances had to be labeled as such. It mandated that packaging sizes had to be consistent with what they claimed to be. It's kind of hard to imagine when that was not the case, but that's what came out of this legislation. It, like the Motor Vehicle Safety Act, was very much focused on the consumers, as Congressman Staggers had indicated he wanted to do. These bills passed through the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee alongside other efforts focused on the American people at large. As he states in his speech of October 1966, bills also included banning children's toys from containing harmful substances, Clean Air Amendments fighting air pollution, Railroad Retirement Act, which ensured pensions, and the Allied Health Professions Training Act, which provided federal support for training medical caregivers and bringing them into communities where they were deeply needed. They were all examples of how Staggers and his colleagues were following that mandate and shifting the focus in the 89th Congress and working on behalf of the American people. In his case, instead of the corporations and businesses, which had long enjoyed very simple support from the Commerce Committee. Now, before we conclude, I will let you know, lest we heap too much praise at Congressman Staggers, you can also thank him for National Daylight Savings Time. That's another bill that comes out of this time period. It's called the Uniform Time Act of 1966, which was passed under his committee. So I'll leave that with you to decide. The work of the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee under the leadership of Chairman Harley O. Staggers was a response to the will of a majority of voters in 1964. The people who had returned Lyndon Johnson resoundingly over Barry Goldwater, and it ushered in a vision of the Great Society. The significant bills protecting consumers that Staggers and the Commerce Committee passed reflected this mandate, alongside the bills passed to protect people living in poverty, to clean up the environment, and to more strictly enforce and ensure civil rights for Black Americans. This same 89th Congress voted and passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Freedom of Information Act, created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. For Congressman Staggers, his pendulum had swung to the left on a wind of one of the most dramatic election upsets in U.S. history. The moment was there to be seized, with opportunity to move the needle in the direction of a stronger role for the federal government in promoting the general welfare of the American people. So as I said, this story of Congressman Staggers' unusual rise to power is one we've known for a while. We've looked at it many times, but when we look at it in the bigger picture, we look at it as a result of 1964, the presidential election, and the other major movements going on at that time. It really does take on a new meaning. The work that was put out of that committee takes on a new meaning. So I hope that that story is interesting to you. I hope that the documents that we've shared are interesting. I encourage you to go to the Byrd Center website and go under the Archives tab, click on Digital Collections, and you can view that exhibit, Path to the Chairman's Seat, which features these documents and many others from the archives here, telling this story and going into more detail about the legislation that was passed in 1965 and 1966 in what we call the Great Society Congress. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions or comments if anybody has any that they would like to share. You're welcome to turn your video on if you'd like, turn your microphone on. Welcome any questions and comments.
Jody, if I can speak.
Absolutely.
A very interesting presentation, and it's really very nice to see the archives used this way too. And I know you have told many stories from this collection, and we get our student interns to go through this kind of material and do papers and do even their special projects that they have to do have come out of the archives. So this is a good example of that, of the kind of all the directions you can go with it when you have a good political archive. So I'm very grateful for your presentation today. And I noticed that Alan Sturm is on today's program. And Alan, thanks to you and I, these papers exist because we went over to Kaiser with the permission of the Staggers family and actually drove a truck over there, went into an open barn on his property up on the top of a mountain where he used to go. We had a little trailer up there, and we gathered those papers and saved them and brought them back to the Byrd Center. And the story of that is another story worth telling. But I see that Alan is on, and I remember those wonderful adventures we had, Alan, when we went over there and saved those papers.
Absolutely. I mean, we appreciate that work so much because this collection has been so interesting to learn about, and it has lent so much support and context to what Senator Byrd was doing at the same time. And now that we have the papers of Robert and Alan Mollahan here at the center, it is contemporary with them as well. And so it really does offer us such a rich resource of stories that we can tie together. So yeah, thank you both so much for the work that went into bringing these papers here.
I believe, Jody, I'm not sure, I believe we brought about 200 cases back that Saturday from the barn, and there was a tractor shed in the Staggers farm. I think Danny still lives there. And there is still a substantial amount of material there that Ray and I left because it was fairly common. It wasn't anything exceptional, but you know, I'm glad that the center has these items, and I'm glad you're making good use of them. And I'm going to contact Danny this afternoon and tell him about this program. I don't see him on here as a participant, but he should be.
Well, we recorded the program, so we'll be able to share it and do that. Congressman Staggers, this moment that we talked about today kind of comes in the middle of his career. He had been elected in 1948, and he served 32 years in the House of Representatives from West Virginia. He retired in 1981. And his son, Harley Staggers Jr., then was elected to the seat 2 years later in 1983 and served for 10 years. His collection is here at the Byrd Center as well. And his is particularly timely because, unfortunately for him, he lost his seat after the 1990 census and the redistricting in West Virginia, which brought us from 4 to 3 seats in the House and pitted him in primary against Alan Mollahan, which he lost in the primary. The beginning, the origins that you see in this moment in terms of how Congressman Staggers approached the Commerce Committee really did endure for the next 16 years. He still is the longest continuously serving chairman of the Commerce Committee in U.S. history. Now, the caveat, as always with the Byrd Center, Michigan Congressman John Dingell is always there to sort of mess up our records. He surpassed Byrd as the longest serving member of Congress. He also surpassed Staggers as the longest serving chairman of the Commerce Committee, but not consecutively. Staggers held onto the position for 16 years continuously, and that's the longest unbroken chairmanship. But throughout that time, he played a significant role in a lot of major legislation, and particularly in his last terms in 1980, 1981, his sort of landmark legislative achievement was passed. It's called the Staggers Rail Act of 1981, and it largely is credited with having saved the American rail industry from completely collapsing in the late 1970s because it redid the regulatory structure over railroads to enable them to better compete with trucking and air shipping providers and companies. He also had a major hand in the dealing with the energy crisis in the late 1970s. He was in one of the largest conference committees in U.S. congressional history. He was the House chair, and Senator Scoop Jackson was the Senate chair, dealing with all of the proposals to deal with the energy crisis at the end of the 1970s. So a really interesting figure. And thanks to Ray and Alan's work, we're able to learn so much more about him here at the center. Phyllis, I see your hand. I think your microphone is off, Phyllis.
Microphone on.
Yeah, you're good.
On now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Jody. It was a wonderful presentation. Some of it bringing back solid memories from the 60s. In particular, I noticed when you put up that bullet memo and asked us if any of us recognize any of the points being part of the Great Society. I was working for the Agriculture Extension Service at the University of Maryland in the 60s. And we did offer adult programs to the community in Southern Maryland, all throughout Maryland. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a direct result of that kind of legislation. In addition, personally, I remember early in the 60s when we installed seatbelts in our own car and we installed them ourselves. And it was a result of a federal mandate or legislation that came out to improve safety for the American citizens most people were not very happy about seatbelts, but we all got used to it.
Right.
And it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I did enjoy all of your presentations, the papers that you pulled. It was really good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's it's really hard for someone like me who's grown up my whole life with those things just being standard and always in place. It's hard to imagine that we ever had a time where those things were not mandated by law. And the Motor Vehicle Safety Act, it really is a big bill. It imposed regulation on automobile producers, tire producers, retailers, people who were selling new and used cars. And as I mentioned, it was signed on the same day as the Highway Safety Act. So that is what then brought in standard road markings and signs and structure around that across the highway system in the United States. It's such a big bill, as are so many of the ones that come out of this period in the Congress. And that bill in particular had as much activity as was going on in the House and the Commerce Committee. The Senate had a lot going on too, and I believe it was Senator Warren Manginson who was the chair of the Commerce Committee in the Senate that oversaw getting this bill through the Senate side. So it was really a massive process, major bill. John.
Jody, thank you for a great presentation. It was mostly new information for me, and I learned a lot. And I'm curious about this pendulum concept that you wove in there. Did Congressman Staggers evolve when the pendulum went back, because he was in the Congress until the early 80s? And have you heard of any other member of Congress that's embraced that kind of pendulum concept?
Well, I'll answer the first part, and I think there might be folks on this call who might be able to answer the second part better than I. But in terms of his personal political philosophy and how he responded to these kinds of issues throughout the rest of his career, he's really interesting. There are cases where he would not, we would not view his actions as being particularly liberal or particularly progressive today, particularly in the early 1970s. And this is a period when he faced probably, in 1972, there's a wave of new Democrats elected into the Congress. The party shifts to a younger generation, and there are several significant challenges to established leaders in the House and the Senate at the time. And one of them that they set their sights on is Harley Staggers. And he weathers it, he survives it, he manages to hold on to power, although he ends up losing a couple of his subcommittee, which they actually passed a rule, and I think I probably agree this is a good idea, that the overall committee chairman should not chair subcommittees of that committee. But that was not a rule at the time, and he was in charge. He was not only overall chair of the Commerce Committee, but he was also chair of its investigation committee, and that got him into trouble a couple times. Probably one that you can read about on the Byrd Center's website. We have a blog about his attempts to subpoena the president of CBS after they broadcast the documentary Selling of the Pentagon. After the Pentagon Papers came out, he saw the documentary and thought that it was very harmful to the government in its criticism, and he wanted access to the footage that had been cut from the final broadcast of the documentary. And Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, refused, and so he attempted to get the House to vote on a subpoena against Stanton, and the House voted him down. It's one of the few cases where that the House had voted down a committee chair. Probably the most famous instance of that kind of activity and him with sort of First Amendment issues. Obviously, this one roiled freedom of the press issues. He attempted to, he filed a complaint with the FCC after John Lennon used the F word in a song, and it was played on the radio in the United States because the FCC came under the Commerce Committee. And so he faced backlash for that as well on freedom of speech grounds. So he, in terms of following the public will, within that pendulum metaphor, he had his stronger times where he was doing that, and then times where he wasn't so much. I think times where his personal philosophy maybe took a little bit more precedence, and things that he found problematic or offensive he pursued. But I would say probably toward the end of his career, seeing the struggle among railroad industry workers, and especially, I mean, as Alan mentioned, his hometown was Kaiser, West Virginia. It's a railroad town. It was the site of a large yard operated by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And when the railroad declined, the city declined. And I have family that live in Kaiser. I've gone there my whole life, and it's never really recovered from that. And so he knew the impact that this was having on his own constituents, but also people across the country. And so he fought hard, especially through the late 1970s, and ultimately winning this fight in the 80s to get the bill passed that modernized the regulations over railroads and enabled them to do some kind of economic activity. So I hope that answers your question in terms of him personally. But in terms of other members of Congress, I'm sure there were others. I mean, it very, very much seems, I came across him quoting it in newspaper articles. I'm sure that it's probably something he read in political philosophy from somewhere. It sounds very much like that. And there may well have been other members who had that same sort of view of the way that that Congress reflected the will of the people at various stages and points throughout American history.
Jody, just kind of on that, I think sometimes we kind of forget how much of a presence Nader's Raiders were. It was not kind of he was kind of a big deal in that sort of pulling back the curtain on really the efforts of the automotive industry, one, to skirt any kind of regulatory oversight by Congress, and two, to subvert and basically discredit any of the surveys and studies that were conducted that showed automobile fatalities and injuries were essentially an epidemic level thing in American society. So that was kind of a muckraking kind of moment that really sort of burst forth, and then that kind of piggybacked on similar kinds of findings about what the tobacco industry was doing about really working to suppress and hide the medical research about sort of cigarettes and tobacco causing cancer. So these two things kind of coalesced. They had been building for several years, but sort of the push to get Congress to act and sort of the wave of that came with Johnson's election in '64 really sort of provides that moment. And that's the thing about Johnson. He understood that was a moment. And he also understood that Congress, that 89th Congress, had 2 years to act, because in the third year, he was going to need to be running for re-election, and ultimately that a significant part of Congress was going to be running for re-election, and the motivation to act would be less. So Johnson really recognized that and pushed it. And a lot of these ideas that had been kind of floundering around for a long time in one shape or another were just kind of forced through with this wave. And the opportunity to regulate automotive manufacturers and retailers and all of that sort of stuff, and the tobacco industry, it all comes out of that. So it is kind of a pendulum, but it's not sort of the 90-degree angle kind of turn that sometimes it seems. It really is kind of a pushing back. And for people who had been in the House for a long time, like Staggers, they understood that, and I think they could see it coming. And the idea that Johnson gave them an indication that he would support it and sign it and stand behind it was also a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act had been proposed in the previous 3 Congresses. And this was, finally passes in 1966. In 2 weeks, on the 27th, when we talk about the Appalachian Regional Development Act, and that being a result of the 1960 presidential election, that is a bill that had been fermenting in various proposals and ideas for the better part of a decade. Going back to when Senator Byrd was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1953. And it took over 10, 12 years to bring that idea into fruition, into a federal act. So, you know, this absolutely was a moment. It was a very a moment that made for really one of the most interesting periods to study in the history of Congress. There's so many tremendous figures in this time period, in the House and the Senate, and so really interesting period to study.
Jody, could I go back to Congressman Staggers for just a minute?
Absolutely.
I knew the congressman for about 20 years, fairly well, and I think it's safe to say that he was not the same man who left Congress in the early 80s, who was elected in 1948. I think, in a sense, you could compare him to Senator Byrd. Senator Byrd is a man who evolved. You know, when we look at Senator Byrd's beginnings and at the end when he was the darling of the liberals, it's hard to believe we're talking about the same man. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's quite as extreme with Congressman Staggers, but I think when he was elected in 1948, he was much more provincial. He's from the small area that you know. And it's interesting, and not a lot of people know this, but one of the first friends that he made in Congress when he was elected was Jack Kennedy.
Right.
I have a letter from Jack Kennedy to Congressman Staggers in 1958 that Staggers was considering running for governorship of West Virginia at the time. And Jack offered to come to West Virginia and campaign for him anytime, any place. And I've talked with Danny and some of the other members of the Staggers family, and apparently he and Jack, after Jack and he were elected to Congress in the late 40s, became very close friends for quite a while. Mm-hmm. So I think that broadened his view of the world. And then when he became involved with the Interstate Commerce Commission and everything that's involved there, I think he became a much different man than he was when he was first elected. I think he did evolve. I think the pendulum theory probably applied to him very much.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and I think I read one time, Alan, that his and Jack Kennedy's offices were next to each other.
I think they were, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when he was first elected, and yeah, it's his only public. But prior to going to Congress, he had been sheriff of Mineral County,
right,
and he had served in the State Road Commission as a right-of-way manager. But other than that, he had been a teacher. He had been a football coach at Potomac State College in Kaiser. He did. There's mention in newspaper articles, biographical things of him, that he did do some work in the summers as a teenager out in the Midwest on farms. He was in Oklahoma, I think, at one point, and that he served mostly in the Pacific during World War II. But he did not come to Congress with the level of legislative experience that Robert Byrd did, having served in both chambers of the state legislature.
That's correct, yes.
Coming to the Congress. His son, Harley Staggers Jr., did serve a term in the state Senate prior to being elected. And interestingly enough, when Congressman Staggers Sr. retired in 1981, his seat was won by Cleve Benedict, a Republican. But then he decided 2 years later to run for the Senate against Robert Byrd, and lost. And that opened then the seat up that Harley Staggers Jr. ultimately served in.
And one of Congressman Staggers' daughters currently still serves in the West Virginia legislature.
Yes.
So the family has a long history of service in West Virginia.
Absolutely. Well, lest it tarnish his record, but I always grew up, my dad telling me the story that apparently Congressman Staggers' father, Congressman Staggers Sr.'s father, had sold my great-grandfather a stolen cow at one point. Don't know whether it's true or not, but tis the family lore that's been passed down. But I also know that at one moment, when my great-grandfather had first gotten signed up for Social Security benefits, and it was around the time when they changed the age, and it ended up messing up the things, and he got a bill for some astronomical amount of money that he could not pay. My grandmother called Congressman Staggers' office, and it was fixed within a day. And that they had that kind of relationship with their members of Congress then, which is so interesting to me. compared to so many of us today. We see them as such more distant figures than they did then. And we do have pictures, and I'll probably put one or two of them in our program in 2 weeks, of Congressman Staggers campaigning for Kennedy when he was running for president in 1960. So a very interesting relationship indeed.
Jody?
Yes.
Lisa, I just want to compliment you. I think your first virtual program was a big success. And it's nice to be able to see you hold forth in your role as an archival historian and scholar and give a full presentation. I haven't had a chance to see that before. It's great. Nice job.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Any other questions from anybody?
Jody, can I plant the seeds for a future program?
Absolutely.
I've mentioned this a couple times, but you mentioned Congressman Mollahan. You just mentioned Cleve Benedict. When you stop and think about it, the entire delegation, congressional delegation from 1980, is still alive and kicking in West Virginia. And I think it would be an interesting program. Maybe we could do it with Zoom to get Mollahan and Nick Joe Rahal and Harley Staggers Jr. and possibly Cleve Benedict and somebody I'm missing here.
Bob Wise.
Bob Wise, in some sort of a Zoom conversation about their service in Congress from West Virginia at that point, and their interactions with Senator Byrd at that point, connected to the Byrd Center. I don't know if they'd be interested in doing that or not, but I think that would be an absolutely fascinating program to try to develop and to watch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alan. I think that's a tremendous idea. It's one of the things that working here at the center has intrigued me so much is, for a state as small as West Virginia, we have had tremendous, significant, powerful players in Congress. From Robert Byrd and Jennings Randolph. Every time I give a tour of the archives here at the center at Shepherd, I let the students know they can thank Senator Randolph that they can vote at the age of 18. Because
going a step further with the Zoom thing, I know that there's some hard feelings between some of those gentlemen at this point. For example, Staggers and Mollahan had a very bitter campaign against each other during the redistricting. But if we could do it by Zoom, at least we could take the physical danger out of the thing.
Yeah, the separation of the Zoom windows might
absolutely
heal the divide. Yeah. No, I appreciate that idea, Alan, and I think it's definitely something we'll look into. Any other questions or comments for anyone? You can always, if you think of something later on and you want to shoot me an email, please feel free. Again, check out the digital exhibit that we did on this story. Also check out, if you search the Great Society Congress, the ACSC exhibit will come up, I think, number 1 or 2 in the Google results. And it's really fascinating. We were so excited to be a part of that. And Congressman Staggers' collection was really helpful for that, not only for the materials you saw today, but also in the section dealing with the Vietnam War. We had lots of letters from Congressman Staggers' papers from constituents around West Virginia dealing with the Vietnam War that ultimately ended up in that exhibit. And if you haven't been on a physical tour of the archives here at the center, hopefully we can do that at some point in the future. And I'll make sure to show you, now that you all have been introduced to Congressman Staggers, his boxes of correspondence. I'm so admirable of his staff, because, and Alan, you may remember this from looking at the papers, you open the box and it looks like a rainbow, because all the constituent correspondence is arranged alphabetically by last name of the constituent, and it's color coded by year with different colors of carbon paper. So you open it up and you see pink, blue, green, yellow, and it all corresponds. It's all in alphabetical order. It's amazingly organized. But a very interesting career, and one that we try to focus on and spotlight alongside of Senator Byrd's immense legacy and career. And I should say, as Ray and Alan mentioned, we have the papers here, and they were rescued from the farm in Kaiser. There is a small collection of his legislative papers at West Virginia University in the West Virginia History Regional Center. And if you go on our website, you'll see that we have a link to their finding aid, and vice versa. They have a link to ours. We did not know that until a couple years ago. I was on the House Representatives Historian's Office website looking at Congressman Staggers' bio, and at the bottom there was a link for a collection at WVU. And I wrote to the curator there, and turned out that they have, if you were to put it all together, they have about 35 to 40%, and we have the remaining 60 to 65% here at the Byrd Center. We have all of his correspondence, his campaign records, his committee-related materials, which is a lot of what you saw today, his photographs, his press collection. We really have a lot of the really rich stuff, and what they have at WVU is sort of the memos and the background research dealing specifically with the bills that he supported. There is another little collection of his that exists elsewhere in the state, but it's been incredibly, I've greatly enjoyed studying and learning more about him here at the center in his career. So, and thank you all so much for taking the time to learn a little bit about him. So he'll pop up again in 2 weeks. So our program in 2 weeks is going to be on the 1960 election in West Virginia. Of course, the Kennedy and Nixon election, and but we'll be talking a lot about the specific impact that election had for West Virginia and Appalachia at large. And Congressman Staggers Sr. certainly figures into that story. So I hope you'll join us for that. Information will be going out about that in our Wednesday mailings. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon.